We welcome you to this further talk from the Golden Rosy Cross. And we would like to ask ourselves the question today, is a spiritual path possible in today's world? And of course, this begs the question, what do we mean by spiritual? And what do we mean by a path? Now we can discuss that according to our own level of consciousness today in the modern world, or we can, and we feel we should, go back into history and point to a number of important references which for the Golden Rosy Cross are not only a spiritual treasure, but also something that is essential. And of course we can look back to Hermes with the Egyptian archgnosis, as we can call it. Many of you have read the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu, and we can also refer to Jesus. Jesus not as a historical being, but as a representative of that inner force that is to be found in every human being. Now, let us come back a bit more to modern times and ask ourselves the question, but in the last, say, 100 years, have there also been representatives, those who indicated a spiritual path? Yes, this is certainly the case. There have been and are persons endowed with a spiritual wisdom, the soul knowledge by which they can link themselves with the spiritual world by an inner process and be able then to refer to a path that has to be brought out in practice. So yes, in modern times, if we look at the end of the 19th century, where it was the Dark Ages, so to speak, and also the continuation of massacres and terrible situations of overruling personal freedom and identity through the Inquisition or through other barbaric systems instituted by so-called Christian or other religions. And if we now look towards the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, we see people like Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. We see Rudolf Steiner developing the anthroposophical movement. We see Max Heindel with the Rosicrucian Fellowship, and also the Lehner brothers in the Netherlands. And all of them testified to an inner path. So when we begin to understand between ourselves what we mean by a path, the path is not an external path. It's not a path of external magical forces and energies we have, but we're talking of entering into oneself. And when we enter into ourselves, it means primarily and necessarily self-knowledge. It also means how we overcome ourselves. How do we overcome our egocentricity, and how can that be changed? How can that be converted? And that can be converted by what we could call a new soul. Not our natural soul, not as we are today, but to give birth to something quite different. And giving birth to the other one in us, I would like here to refer to 3 Latin phrases which summarize the spiritual path as presented by the Golden Rosy Cross, even though they are in Latin, but they're very contemporary and very relevant to our world today. The first is ex Deo nascimur, born of God. Yes, this means that every human being has the possibility to be born of God, not an external God, but that inner being in the very core of every human being, where we have that powerful divine being. Because is it not said in the Bible, if we take that as an example of a spiritual testimony or a spiritual text, that the kingdom of God is in you? That means the kingdom of God is closer than our hands and our feet. And through that inner process of self-discovery, we come into contact with the divine force. So we can then say, born of God. And then the next step will be, and in Latin it is in Jesu morimur, which means we die in Jesus. And this, dear friends, is not a reference to the past, not a reference to a historical figure, but is a reference to an inner force, which is that force we are talking about, present above the physical heart, in the etheric heart, which we can talk about the seed, the grain, so therefore the seed of Jesus that has to be born in the stable, who has to be born in a pitiful situation, surrounded by ignorance, surrounded by darkness. And that is who we are. Yet the light can shine in us if we can testify to the fact of being reborn, but where Jesus is born in us. And when we talk of reborn, the third sentence in Latin is per spiritum sanctum revivissimus. So that means to be able to be reborn of the Spirit. The soul, the new soul, links itself then to the Spirit, to that vertical monadic force that comes through the pineal gland and enters into contact with the soul, and then the three sanctuaries in the fourfold personality begin to change. So it is not the I consciousness of the pelvic sanctuary, the I consciousness of the heart sanctuary, and the I consciousness of the head sanctuary. No, we're talking of a new state of being. And that new state of being is in the square, which is the fourfold personality. And what is the fourfold personality? It is the personality with its four bodies. And esoteric science and the Lehner brothers, later called Jan van Rijkenborg and supported by another person called Catharos de Petri, were able to present very clearly the path of man through knowledge of man as well, which is the physical body, the etheric body, the astral body, and the mental body. And in those bodies, a process comes about, because through that pre-remembrance, through that inner seeking for the light, because the light calls us, the light in the heart calls us, that Jesus principle in us, we undertake a path, which is described in so many traditions. And then our willing, our desiring and acting will change. And it becomes then a triangle of a new desire, of a new will, and through that a new life's practice. And as that person moves along the path, then the fourfold personality changes. The willing, the desiring, and the acting will no longer be based on the I desire, but on the inner force that will speak through all our senses and will give us guidance and energy. So we can then enter into the circle of eternity. And there is, dear friends, a point that has to be attached to those three symbols of the square, of the triangle, and the circle, which is the point in the center. And that point is the Logos. That point is the Gnosis in revelation, which can come about in every single human being. Do you desire that? Do you feel that? Do you see the necessity of a radical, revolutionary change in your being? So we would like to say, not that the spiritual path, is it possible or not in our world? We say that it is an absolute necessity. It is so necessary to be able to change the state of consciousness, which is no longer an I consciousness. And these are words which we can address to politicians, to activists, social activists, to artists, and others who may be going along the religious path as well, to start from the inner core and not from the desire to overcome, to dominate, to try and fight for one's country, one's region, one's own interests, but the interests of humanity, the interest of this world, because we see there is an enormous amount of suffering, and that suffering permeates into the environment, and the environment is so polluted because these other subtle areas, subtle spheres are also polluted. And the only way to have a clear mind and a clear heart is to find the very core of our being in ourselves. And therefore we are not saying that is the spiritual path possible. We're saying yes, the spiritual path is a dire necessity for humanity today, and the Golden Rosy Cross accompanies you in this process. We thank you very much for your attention, and we remain at your disposal through the Golden Rosy Cross sites and through our direct contact with webinars, conferences around the world, to be able to identify and to follow that inner calling, freed from all dogma, freed from philosophy, freed from beliefs, but related to that vertical eternity we can find in ourselves.